I'm John McLeese, and we are starting our fall session of adult forums on the race to incarcerate and criminal justice reform. Talking with Al Sharp's help on various speakers about how we came to the point of having 3 million people in prison, whether that's a good idea, what the costs are, and what the alternatives are, and efforts underway around the country on a bipartisan basis to address that. Al is going to be our opening speaker. Al is the founder and director of Clergy for Drug Policy. He's very active in legislative matters and other matters. Al is a graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's had a number of positions over the years in public service agencies, the board of the Coalition for the Homeless, interim executive director of the Community Renewal Society, and a great person to introduce this topic. Al.
Okay, I should start by saying with this size group, it ought to be a chatty little forum, and you're welcome to interrupt me with questions at any time. But frankly, this is such a complicated topic that I really have taken the time to prepare a fairly orderly presentation. What I've been asked to do, and I'm delighted to do, is kick off this remarkable set of discussions and presentations on Sundays through mid-December, starting today, on the topic Christian responses to crime and punishment, mass incarceration, and criminal justice reform. I will start with my personal background so you know, full disclosure, what perspective I bring to this issue. You can see that perspective by looking at the brochure that is on your chair. I'm going to ask somebody, whether it's John or somebody else, to pass around a clipboard which enables you to put down your name and email. I don't need the other information. In case you do like what you hear, you are engaged in this topic, and you'd like to receive our newsletter. Frankly, it's an awful good newsletter that deals certainly with the work of my organization, Clergy for a New Drug Policy. I'm happy to say that the mission statement is very clear. We mobilize clergy nationally to end the war on drugs and to seek a health, not punishment response to drug use. That's relevant to this topic because I got personally involved in this topic by going down to Springfield with the organization I headed, and Judith knows this, for 15 years, Protestants for the Common Good. And we started with the issue, people coming out of prison need a second chance. The idea that you pay your debt to society in this country is an absolute myth. The more my colleague and I, who worked with me on this, were in Springfield, the more we realized there were so many people in prison that shouldn't be there. They were there for low-level drug offenses. So that's what got me into helping to push back what is called the war on drugs. And all that was before Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And I would start by asking how many of you have read or even know about the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in this country is the subtitle. Well, I would urge you, if nothing else, to read that. And I will say I'm a little bit surprised because you can actually go to most churches in the Chicago metropolitan area and they will have probably dealt with this book. I'm going to interrupt your video, John, by actually going to get a copy of the book, which is in my briefcase, and then do not that.
And in the interim, I would mention for those who've just arrived that we have for you copies of a book that goes into some detail on these issues, The Race to Incarcerate, that you can check out using a library card in the books at the back and give your name and phone number and email, and then bring it back when you've had a chance to read it. Al?
Read this book. It explains mass incarceration in this country, and that's what we're here to talk about. Now, there have been revisionist theories, as there is with any good idea, where people come along and say, that's not the complete story. But she is the Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin during the time of the Civil War. She is the Harriet Beecher Stowe.
What's her name again?
Pardon?
The name? Her name?
The name is The New Jim Crow.
What's the author's name?
Michelle Alexander.
Okay.
Now, preceded by her book, which was written in 2011, by 4 or 5 years, and I show you this book because I love the title, and it explains a lot, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Punishment. Those of you who know Max Weber, the Protestant Ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he's really playing on this title. The man who wrote it was T. Richard Snyder. He came up with the phrase culture of punishment. That's what guides clergy for a new drug policy, and that's what explains mass incarceration in this country. We are a culture of punishment. And if we were having a more informal discussion, and you will have these as you go forward with this series, you might say, is that true and why is that true? I profoundly believe that it is true. So the issues that I work on are on the front end of the war on drugs, saying if I had a magic wand, what would I change that would somehow affect the spirit of punishment in this country? And if you look at the agenda items that are in the brochure you have, you'll see what I came up with. The drug laws, moving towards diversion, keeping people out of the criminal justice system. Harm reduction, saying that abstinence only isn't the only way to respond to drug abuse. There are a lot of other important things that you can do. Changing sentencing laws, all of those things. So, but we've got a limited amount of time, right? Dee Dee was wondering if we could even get through it in this amount of time. I'm going to make 4 points about mass incarceration, about what this series is about. And the first is very simple. Mass incarceration is real. For those of you who have heard about this topic, you're probably tired of hearing people say the United States has 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. That's more than any other country in the world, China, Russia. There may be 1 or 2 minor exceptions, but that's very much the truth. And this is where Michelle Alexander started. And I'm going to give you some data, and then I'm going to move beyond data to a discussion, so bear with me on some of the numbers. When she wrote her book, there were 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country, 1 in every 100. 5 times higher than 40 years earlier. The impact of the war on drugs is very significant. 500,000 people were in prison or jail for a drug offense today, compared to 41,000 in 1980. 41,000 to 500,000 for drug offenses. And most of those are non-violent offenses. These aren't the cartel guys. These are the people that are actually trying to make enough money to pay their families, if they have families to live, who are selling on the street corners and getting sent to jail for those non-violent offenses. Second main point, mass incarceration has devastated African American communities. Now, you start with the notion, and this is so widely expressed that I'm sure it's credible. African Americans are not more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than are whites. It's just the white folks do it in the enclave of their suburban communities. Nobody goes after them. But the numbers of possession and use and probably sales are equal roughly across races. Now, Toni Preckwinkle is going to be one of your speakers, the county board executive. And she tells a story. We're talking now about the impact on the African American community. As you know, she has 2 major responsibilities as our county executive: for the prison system, the jail system, and for the health system in Cook County. She does other things, but those are the main areas of responsibility. And she likes to tell the story. She may tell it when she's here, and she has accepted the invitation to come here, so spread the word. This is a great series. She says, well, I remember when we had somebody, as so often happens, from other countries coming in to look at Cook County Jail. And they had the tour, and they went all around, and she probably visited cells and saw the whole thing. They came back to her office, and they said, where's your jail for white people? Where's your jail for white people? If any of you have ever visited Cook County Jail, you know exactly, have you? So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. One more number. The black inmate population is 7 times higher, 7 times in 2000 than in 1970. Listen to this. This is a statistic, or it's a generalization. It's chilling. More young black men in Illinois are likely to go to prison than to go to college. 1 in 3 black men in this country 1 in 3 will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. You can read that assertion in the Mark Maurer piece that we hope you will take home with you as you leave. Impact on neighborhoods. We've talked about the impact on incarceration generally, the impact of the war on drugs and mass incarceration more broadly on the black community, and of course the Hispanic community, minorities. Impact on neighborhoods. Some of you may know Paula Wolf, who's been a civic leader for years, was Governor Jim Thompson's policy director for his full 4 terms. She used to commute to Springfield to do this. In preface to the quote that I'm going to give you, one of the conditions of parole, if you're on parole, is that you cannot associate with felons. But fully 70% of the men between the ages of 18 and 25 in North Lawndale are ex-offenders. They are felons, 70%. So this led to her comment, and it's quoted in The New Jim Crow, the book that I showed you. It's hard for a parolee to walk to the corner store to get a carton of milk without being subject to a parole violation. These offenses compound on themselves. You know, you get out, you can't associate with someone who's on parole, you talk to somebody who's on parole, police picks you up, you've got 2 strikes, and there are 3 strikes in your outlaws, which means if you do one more thing, you're in jail for life. 3 strikes and you're out. And I'm not sure how this applies in Illinois, but I know in New York that was, and Bill Clinton brought this into effect nationally. 3 strikes and you're out, you're in prison for life. So you've already got 2 strikes against you. If you have a minor offense, you come out and you talk to a parolee. Okay. Now, let me set a broader context, which you probably know, but it's worth keeping in mind as you hear all of these numbers, all of these statistics, and the discussion that I'm going to bring forward. We did this with Protestants for the Common Good. We did a demographic map of the Chicago metropolitan area showing where people live by income level. So you knew where poor people lived. We did a demographic map that showed where people lived by race. What is so chillingly true then was, and is now, if you put the poverty map on the income level map, on the race map, in other words, the income map on the racial demographic map, the 2 coincide almost exactly. The reason I say that is that if you want to kind of wrestle with some of the things that we're going to talk about now in greater detail, not just native, you're probably going to be inclined to say, yeah, well, there were people arrested in black communities because that's where the crime is. And that's true. But let's also remember that crime happens where poverty is the deepest. So it's not just as simple as saying these are, African Americans or Hispanic. It's folks that are living in concentrated poor neighborhoods. So keep that in mind as we wrestle with what really has caused mass incarceration and what we can do about it. Because having set the stage for you and said it's real, it devastates African American communities, especially, our goal, of course, is to make something better. Isn't that what Rector Smedley said in his sermon this morning? We're pilgrims trying to improve things. Okay. Now, third generalization, and I'm not going to elaborate on this, I'm just going to lament it with you, is that the Cook County Jail is the largest mental health hospital in this country. 30%, and these numbers can vary, but it's conservative to say that 30% of the people who are in Cook County Jail are mentally ill. Incidentally, I noticed at least a couple of you taking notes. I'm happy to share what I've done. Put your email down and I'll send you all this. You don't have to write it down. I'm too old to learn PowerPoint, but I'm experienced enough at least to be prepared. So, 30% of folks in Cook County Jail are mentally ill. At least 60% have substance abuse problems. Let's just think about that fact when we think about when punishment is and isn't warranted in our society and what our proper response should be. The fourth thing, I can say it in a single sentence, is this fourth point that before the discussion of why and what we do about it. 50%, roughly, of all folks that come out of prison are back in 3 years. Back in 3 years. So those are the main points I want you to keep in mind as we talk about the reality of mass incarceration. Now, what are the causes? Michelle Alexander was the only game in town probably to the last 2 or 3 years, although there was an earlier revision of her theory, which I'm going to describe to you. Her simple explanation, and I think it's largely true, was the reality of the war on drugs. I'm not here to talk politics with you, but on this one I'm going to make the political point. The origin of the war on drugs started for political reasons, and it happened in 1971, although Ronald Reagan was the one that ramped it up on steroids in the 1980s. It was race-driven, and many of you may have heard this quote. A member of the White House staff, and it was John Ehrlichman, said in 1968, you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. And in looking to the votes they wanted, one of his colleagues added, we're after the racists. So what he did, what Nixon did in declaring a war on drugs, was conflate race and crime. Some of you may remember the 60s. You've certainly read about them. There was a lot of crime. After a period of low level of crime and low level of incarceration, the 60s and 70s were turbulent. Nixon was running for re-election in the midst of all that. So the war on drugs began really in earnest, as I've said, under Ronald Reagan in the 80s. Public opinion wasn't thinking about the war on drugs in the 1980s. Less than 2% in 1981 viewed it as the most important issue facing the country in 1981. 64% viewed it as the most important issue facing the country in 1989. So there was a whole publicity machine at work. A lot of things happened. The way Reagan pressed the war on drugs was, first of all, federal funding. The Drug Enforcement Agency grew from, I think, $86 million at the beginning of his time, funded at the level of over $1 billion in 1991. Just one agency. Increased sentences came down, especially the mandatory minimums in 1986 and 1988, driven out of a fear of the war on drugs. And especially drug laws, not just mandatory minimums. You may have heard of the disparity between what people are punished for using crack as opposed to using powdered cocaine. There was a 100-to-1 ratio because the folks that were using powdered cocaine who were doing it more in the white-collar offices and in the suburbs and so forth. That was the one part of it. But crack cocaine was intense, boiled down into cubes. So if you had crack cocaine, your sentencing was 100 times more severe based on quantity of drug than for powder cocaine. That's since been changed. The leadership with Dick Durbin of our state. I think it's quite sad that it was changed only to 18-to-1. I mean, what are we thinking? But it was at least some change. Now, I mentioned, and this is where it gets a little bit more subtle, the first revision of Michelle Alexander saying, it was just the war on drugs, and indirectly she was kind of saying it's a new caste system like slavery and the Jim Crow laws after the Civil War to the new Jim Crow, the title of her book, in the form of the war on drugs. And it might have been conscious, but it was pretty close to conscious, and it was certainly racist. A remarkable book was written by a Harvard professor in 2012. I didn't bring it to show you, called The Collapse of the American Justice System. A man named William Stuntz. It was a delight to prepare for this series because I haven't read the book. I now have, and it's a remarkable book. And in a very thoughtful way, he began to look at the legal explanations. What happened to our criminal justice system, which he thinks is profoundly broken, which might explain a lot of what Michelle Alexander also explained. Poignant personal story with him. Harvard law professor, evangelical Christian, surprise number one. Second sadness is that he died at age 52 of cancer and rushed to write this book to get it out. He is paid vast tribute by the full legal community, anywhere from the University of Chicago to, perhaps, different environments. Remarkable book. Now, I will read here were his theories. The first thing he said was, in the 60s, we began to emphasize procedural law in such detail that things began to slow down. You all have watched Law and Order, and you see, and I love that show, so you see the detectives always saying, you've got the right to remain silent, so you've got a right to a lawyer. Well, that was one of the procedural things. Another procedural change was what you could do from legal versus illegal searches, what evidence could be introduced. The right to counsel. So, and the Warren Court did all those things, and Stuntz said that had a profound effect on the legal system. It bogged us down. And in response, legislators, because we're talking about the turbulent period in the 60s, began to say, wow, we've got to put people in jail. Things are bad out there. And so they started doing sweeping substantive changes in the law, which might not have been as great if the system could work as well as it probably had with all these procedural changes. So it's a subtle point, but we got to move beyond Michelle Alexander. So listen to this amazing statistic. 95% of all felony convictions in metropolitan areas in this country are plea bargains. 95% are plea bargains. We think of trial by jury, we think of all the ways we think the criminal justice system works. It doesn't work that way. You also, and he talks about the difference between our justice system under what we would consider local democracy. Police were local, prosecutors and trial judges were more likely to come from the community that they were making judgments about as far as who appeared before them or who was arrested. That's not true anymore. You may have elected prosecutors and you may have elected trial judges, but they live in communities very different from the communities we're talking about where the war on drugs has come down. So he sees the change in how our democracy functions in relation to our criminal justice system as saying that's why prosecutors can proceed in the way that they do without kind of the checks and guidelines that have led to kinds of incarceration we're talking about. So you have the growing popularity of these sweeping laws, 3 strike laws, mandatory minimums, all these things stacked in the prosecutor's favor, and every incentive because they've got large numbers of crimes coming through, they want to settle as quickly as they can, and so you have this result of 95% of plea bargaining and not really very much accountability. Now the second revisionist was a man named John Pfaff in a book called Locked In. Came out just about a year and a half ago. I remember seeing that book, and Rebecca Janowitz, whom you know, John, in Tony Prenker's office, started citing the statistics in this book, and I felt kind of rejected because he was really saying the war, Michelle Alexander's accusations aren't the whole story, and he says that simply because the numbers don't add up in the way that she thought they did. He said, if you eliminate all the people who were in prison for drug offenses, it would not reduce the population nearly as much as you think it would. It's only about 300,000 out of the 2.1 million nationally that are in our prison system. So the war on drugs obviously had an impact, but just in terms of the sheer numbers, it can't be the full explanation. And again, his explanation is prosecutors. What prosecutors are doing and the fact that there are not the checks on them and the supervision that one might hope for. He writes that the reward for prosecutors are for making more prisoners. They're also crippled by the fear of seeming too lenient. One bad case for a prosecutor can affect him or her in the next election. So look at where this incentive is. I think that's really what I'll say about him. But in terms of this series, you want to test Kim Foxx, who has now replaced Anita Alvarez as the state's attorney for Cook County. And of course, she got defeated in no small measure because of one case. Do you know what case I'm talking about? McQuan McDonald. She never got over that. And so that's the one case problem with prosecutors. Kim Foxx, I think, is trying to shape her office in a way that I don't believe Anita Alvarez did. And you want to ask Kim Foxx to what extent she really is dealing with the realities that John Pfaff and William Stuntz really bring forward. Okay. What are the points of difference in how we address the mass incarceration. You're going to be hearing speakers, and you're going to be hearing people present different points of view, and you're going to come to terms yourself, I hope, with what we do. And it's going to be a serious debate. And here are what I think the elements of that debate are. And let me give you some background, just so you know a little bit about trends in incarceration. Low incarceration in the 50s and 60s. Crime went up significantly in the 70s, as you probably know. Declined, and this is all in the Mark Moorer book that you will get. Declined from 80 to 84. Went up again 84 to 92. Began to decline in 1992. So up, down, back up. Mass incarceration, and we're talking about crime and then mass incarceration as a response, started in the 80s under the war on drugs. This lasted for 3 centuries.
3 decades.
The prison population has been going up throughout this entire period. So you have a decline in crime, but in the meantime, prison population is growing up. So that's the underlying reality that we're dealing with. And let me just say, and that's why it's good that you have speakers who know more about all of this than I do, the relationship between crime and punishment is not at all obvious. I mean, there are very complex factors, economic factors, community attitude factors, the way you deploy your police. All these things are not obvious. So here's where I think the points of difference are going to be as you consider this over the next 3 months. Question: to what extent is the drop in crime since 1992 due to increased incarceration? Does punishment work? That's the profound question, and I think that's the profound religious question. I said that the T. Richard Snyder book, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Punishment, which is a religious book, that's what he addresses. And I operate from the notion that we are a culture of punishment, and as a matter of our faith, that's got to change. So, but that's the debate. And I'm going to read you a quote now from Michael Rushford, president of the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation. Now, these are the law and order critics. He's one of them. What the reformers never want to talk about is that in the 80s and 90s, once we incarcerated a lot of people, the crime rate went down around the country. Over the past 10 years, we've been winning the war of attrition on crime because the deterrent effect works. People don't commit crimes because they don't want to go to prison. People don't commit crime because they don't want to go to prison. The reformers, I put myself in that category, are teaching the opposite lesson. If a guy is stealing cars and he finds he's never going to go to prison for stealing cars, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to steal a lot of cars and then move on to something else. Now, I would say that also is the voice you would hear from Jeff Sessions. But we're not going to necessarily go into that today, but I think that's what we're hearing. Now, anyone know David Clark? That name mean anything to you? Sheriff of Milwaukee County. African American. President Trump loves him. He wears a cowboy hat. He has a coffee mug on his desk that says John Wayne. He's a very aggressive law and order person. And listen to his quote. My soft on crime opponents, he's just resigned incidentally for nothing other than the fact I think that he's had the job for 25 years. My soft on crime opponents emerged from Candyland, he's ridiculed us, to propose second chances, third chances, fourth chances, in the process endangering our homes, neighborhoods, and schools. Those who violate society's rules over time need to pay the price. They need to be punished for their behavior. That's how you change behavior. That's a quote from the New Yorker, Jeffrey Tobin, whom you see every night on CNN. Now, that's the law and order argument. Now, Mark Maurer, whom I hope we can get for our Thursday night session starting later in the fall, would say that there's very good evidence that only maximum a third, probably less, of the decline in crime since late 90s is due to incarceration policy. But these are, again, subtle, difficult judgments. That's why people can be so vehement on either side of the issue. But here's something from the report that Governor Rauner commissioned 2 years ago in Illinois. He asked a bunch of very prestigious people to look at our prison population, reduce it by 25% in 10 years. You're going to be hearing from 2 speakers who were on that commission. That's the kind of program that John has pulled together. And listen to the quote from the introduction to that commission, which is reported. Research and experience has shown that these assumptions are mistaken in part. while criminal punishment, meaning that punishment is what creates the reduction in crime, while criminal punishment generally has a broad deterrent effect, research does not support the assumption that increasing prison populations is an effective or efficient way to increase deterrence, particularly if the sentences are lengthy. And this, I believe with all my heart, is true. Certainly, swiftness and fairness are far more important. And then it makes the second point, if you're talking about how much punishment to proceed with. When you do all that punishment, you're doing an awful lot to the communities in which the concentration of criminals live, and you in fact create conditions where they can't. You impair their ability to move forward, either as a community or as individuals within that community. So that's the first question. Does punishment work? Has it explained the reduction in crime? Very relevant to the notion of mass incarceration. And then the second thing is, deep down, what drives our response? What causes do we ascribe to criminal activity? Is it environment? All the things that we know make people's lives hard, especially poor people, especially African Americans. We do have a history of racism in this country. Or is it the lack of opportunity? Is it the environment on the one hand? Or is it personal moral failure? Lack of individual responsibility? That's the profound debate. Well, you got to wrestle with that. And I think as Christians, we're called to have a point of view on it. You can't live in Chicago, especially as a citizen, and not at least have a theory of change, a theory of what causes what we're talking about. Okay, here I think is the most interesting part, and I think your speakers will all speak to this. What can we do? Sentencing laws. Actually, to my surprise, we've got more time than I thought we would. Any questions up until this point? Yeah.
Two things. One, my nephew died of a drug overdose in a house of a dealer.
Yeah.
In a suburb. Nothing.
Yeah.
No. The police advised not to do anything. You can't do anything. Secondly, and so it seems like a whole weird, unjust system. Secondly, I've been tutoring at St. Leonard's, and it's my impression, they never sit and talk about it, but you can hear gossip or something. They're all picked up for low-level things, and it's constant harassment, and it's almost all African American. There are a few younger whites, and it seems like somehow something went wrong, or they were in the wrong place, and it's just it seems unfair.
You might want to mention what St. Leonard's House is.
Yeah, St. Leonard's House is I don't know if halfway house is the right word, but it's a house, a place that individuals go when they have come out of prison and they are supported in their reentry.
Now it's an Episcopal charity.
Pardon? Yeah,
It's an
and it
Episcopal
is.
charity.
In fact, we had a big debate as we were restructuring the board. Is it an Episcopal agency? In which case, it has to have more than half the board has to be Episcopal. And we're doing that. We're doing that because we take that very seriously. It's worthy of your support. Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question of confirmation. How many people are in jail in the United States, and how many of those in jail, percentage-wise, are there for a drug offense?
The figure is going down slightly. It was at the peak of Michelle Alexander's argument, 2.3 million. It's probably down to about 2.1 million. And I would say drug offenses, 30%,
30%.
It's not the majority, which is really the impression she created.
Thank you.
But I would say that the war on drugs created the kind of sentencing that expanded the reach so that you caught more people, even though the sentencing was driven by the war.
Yeah. Thank
My
you.
impression is that most of the murders committed in Chicago and the surrounding area are by whites. I don't mean drive-by shootings. I mean actual planned murders.
I don't know a lot about that. I do know
So
that
it'd be interesting to know the percentage of whites, the blacks, the Hispanics in the overall Illinois prisons.
I would guess it's probably about 50%. you know, roughly, it's much more close to the center than the proportion who are there for drug offenses. And I don't know who commits violent crimes. My image is an awful lot of it is driven by gang cartels in a prohibited environment when it
I'm
comes to
talking about
killing each
people
other.
murdering their husbands, their
Yeah.
children, all
Right.
this, I mean, these are almost all white.
Yeah, but I don't know. I'm not going to say something. Dee?
Al, can you talk about the effects of a private prison, the business of prisons moving into the private for-profit sector?
Good question. John Pfaff, whom I'm cited as one of our revisionists, would say, yeah, everybody, you know, wrings their hands about private prisons. That's only 8% of the prison population. It doesn't explain a lot of the numbers.
8%?
8%. I'm quite sure of that because I just know that number.
For private, 8%.
Our private, 8% of our prisoners are in private prisons.
State and federal.
I believe so. In fact, wasn't there a law saying you can't have federal and private prisons?
No. The President Obama, Secretary General, announced a year ago that that was going to be phased out.
Yeah.
It's unclear, obviously. No, but I wonder if it may be higher than 8% if you take into account the states. But
I'll check that.
yeah.
The figure I remember from John Pfaff is 8%. But, you know, then you come, William Stuntz, whom I also cited, talking about private prisons, and what he said was, there's such a thing as moral stigma. In fact, even though it may be only 8%, it's a moral blot on our society that you have people who are being held in prison by individuals who have a profit motive. I'll tell you a little anecdote. You'll be probably horrified at my views on drug policy. Certainly, I think marijuana ought to be legal. I was in Arizona campaigning for legalizing marijuana in Arizona last fall. They had two major sources opposing legalizing marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
The first was the Catholic Church that gave $1 million. The second, and I don't quite remember the name of the group, but let's call it Food Services Corporation, gave $800,000 because they knew that if the prison population dropped, and I don't think the marijuana population actually affects prisons that much, if the prison population dropped, they would not make as much money selling food to prisons. That's morally reprehensible.
Now, in terms of prisons, could you comment, I guess you may be planning to, about just the sheer impact of the increase in number of prisons that were built, in significant part because of the initiatives of the Clinton administration to put out billions of dollars to finance municipalities that, by result of the previous recessions, had been kind of strapped. But if they put their money into prisons, they could get a lot of federal aid.
I don't know the number. The question was how many prisons have been built.
And the impact of filling those on the whole structure of things.
Yeah, if you build it, they will come, you know, the field of dreams. That certainly was a phenomenon. And it actually happened in the Clinton years. I mean, Clinton was so ambivalent. On the one hand, he was afraid of being accused of being soft on crime. He traveled all the way back to Arkansas to preside over the execution of someone who was certifiably mentally ill in prison, was facing the death penalty. That's the bad Bill Clinton. The good Bill Clinton was that he knew that diversion and prevention were also important, but he funded an increase in the building of prisons. I don't know the number, but I do know that I was down in Springfield probably 3 or 4 years ago, and one legislator was tearing her hair out. We wanted to change on some of the sentencing laws, and she said, "You can't close the prison in my town. It will shut down the town." So there's an economic incentive, especially in rural areas. Dee, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess a little bit of a follow-up with Jim's point, and that is the private prisons are something kind of on their own, but I think with the larger imprisonment generally, and I think on the federal level, is what you mentioned now, the idea that you've got smallish communities where putting a federal prison is a source of income, a source of employment, private or not.
Yep.
Right? This is an industry.
Yep.
And it's financed by the federal government, by our tax dollars, to imprison the other members of our communities.
Yep.
So it's just a shifting of wealth, which
Yep.
is part of that whole conversation of income disparity also. That's another broad topic we don't have to hit.
Yep.
But my original point was going back to the point that you had made a study, the kind of law and order notion of crime rates have dropped, but prison populations have remained the same. The debate being, well, has the crime rate dropped due to punishment?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm assuming studies have been done, and I don't know, maybe you know, comparing our incidence of criminal behavior or kind of crime statistics and punishment on our side versus, for example, the Swedish
Yeah,
method, which is not punitive as much as it is rehabilitative.
yeah. I don't know those studies. That's a very good question. I was trying to point to the notion that someone like Mark Lauer would say that punishment has not been the deterrent. The sole reason that David Clark, the Milwaukee sheriff, or the other person that I read from, the strict law and order people, would argue. That's the great debate. It would be good to look at some of the European experience because the prison systems are very generous, very, very different. And I do want to come back to your point because it's just got to be said. Things are so different in the white community as to what is enforced. And the most dramatic example is how we're responding, and I was going to come to this later anyway, how we are responding to the opioid crisis in this country. When we had the crack cocaine epidemic in the early 1980s, you know what happened? Blacks were stereotyped, they were villainized, crack, babies seemed to be the order of the day, a lot of which has been revised in terms of theory, and that's where mass incarceration really started. Now that so many whites, especially white youth and in our suburbs, are affected by the opioid crisis, I don't know if you know the extent to which this is happening, you know where I'm headed. Police, and it started in Gloucester, Massachusetts 2 years ago, and I publicized the first example of it happening in the Chicago metropolitan area a little bit after that. The police chief of Gloucester, Massachusetts, because he'd had about 4 opioid deaths in his community in just a couple of weeks, went on Facebook and he said, if you bring in your drug paraphernalia into our office, we won't arrest you. We will find you treatment. Fast forward a year and a half later, 300 police chiefs have just signed a contract with Pam Rodriguez's agency called TASC, Treatment Alternative for Safe Communities, which is the organization that drug courts who let people go to treatment rather than being incarcerated, who they contract with. Over 300 police chiefs and TASC are systematically pursuing that option. In other words, when it's, and I see no African Americans in this room, when it's us that are affected, you know, God, we're going to respond, we're going to try to help. It's a national problem. When it happened in the 80s, it was those guys.
And Pam has agreed to be one of our speakers.
Pam, I should say, has agreed to be one of our speakers. Yes, sir.
You mentioned 2 maps that could be overlaid, the poverty map and the racial map.
Right.
Do you also have a map of drug use?
I don't, except I think I can make the generalization that use is pretty much equal between whites and blacks and Hispanic.
How about income?
Income.
How about poverty as a trigger for drug use?
Good question, and I would, if my generalization, if all the above are true, it probably shouldn't be all that different. And yet intuitively I would think, I mean, if there's anything that, let's there are 2 kinds of drug use. I would say 3. People that need, let me tell you a story.
You have time.
Okay. I, at one point, was looking, I can give you a lot of facts and figures, but I was looking for people that could actually tell stories about their lives. That's what's really going to change your mind. It's not me giving you numbers. So I went to McDonald's up in Roosevelt and Kedzie, which is a pretty tough neighborhood. There was someone up there that I wanted to meet. He'd been in prison for a long time. He'd come out. He was actually doing very good constructive work, helping people re-enter. We sit down in this McDonald's in California and Kedzie. It was a different country. I mean, I've been around a lot of different areas, neighborhoods. I was in a different world. And first of all, I was the only white there, but beyond that, just everything. And so I was talking to this person and just about the experience and about the environment. He said, Al, 70% of the people in this room, in this McDonald's, are high on something. And I then said, what about legalizing drugs? How do you feel about that? And we can talk about that in greater detail. And actually, a visceral look of horror came on his face. He said, Al, you don't realize, you'd be taking away the income that enables people to feed their family. So that's the first kind of drug use. The second is recreational. Most of us drink. Let's call that recreational. And I think that an amazing number of people, about 90% of people that use even cocaine and heroin, don't become addicts, which should say something about who we should be arrested. And then the third person is the addict, the person who's ill. And I can get into the question of whether it's a disease or what it is, but let's call them certainly addicts. The single largest cause, the best definition of addiction that I know is isolation, social isolation. Move from that to trauma and stress. And that's basically what causes addiction. It's so complex that I hesitate, especially as a non-clinician, to speak about it. But I know those generalizations are very, very important. So if that's true, that has some bearing on your answer, who actually is on drugs. I don't know the numbers by neighborhood. Let me now actually move forward a little bit, because there are a couple of points I want to make. What can we do? The Rauner Commission, which I described earlier, wanting to reduce prison population by 25% in 10 years, has recommendations. Now, you can act on those recommendations, and when David Olson comes and when Pam Rodriguez comes, ask her about these recommendations, because they'll be speaking to you. They were on the Rauner Commission. You can make significant changes in sentencing. You can reclassify sentences for drug offenses. You can make Class 4 felony simple possession a misdemeanor. Class 4 felony is the lowest level of felony. You would know this better than I do. You can make that a misdemeanor. I would argue that's not enough, but hold that for a second. You can give sentence credits for good behavior. You can repeal mandatory minimums. You can raise the felony threshold for retail theft and other property crimes. So many of our crimes are what are called property crimes, church crimes. Somebody breaks into a church to steal an offering because they need that to live. What is our threshold for crimes of theft? So that's one thing. I'd be irresponsible, especially given the fact that I talked about Cook County Jail as the largest mental health hospital in the country, if I didn't say something about healthcare. And the thing I'm going to say about healthcare, without getting into the national debate, is that, and Clergy for New Drug Policy brought this forward before most people were thinking about this in this way. What Obamacare did that we cannot let go is they defined 10 essential medical benefits. And one of them, for the first time in this country, was mental health treatment. If you go the way a lot of people want to go in this country and repealing and replacing Obamacare, you're going to lose the kind of mental health services that, first of all, have helped Cook County Hospital get on a level playing field financially, and providing mental health services to about 2.8 million people that are now funded by Obamacare for mental health treatment. We desperately need those services. Third thing, and Pam Rodriguez is the expert on this, we can move towards diversion. I've told you about what police chiefs are doing. There are other kinds of diversion that are happening. Diversion simply means that police can, instead of arresting people, they can steer them directly to treatment. That first started in Seattle, Washington, where all the stakeholders, the police chief, the public defender, the mayor, the county executive got together and said, what we're doing isn't working. They contracted with a major social service agency. They authorized police when they saw people that they'd been arresting 15 times, 20 times, 30 times, most of whom they knew, to steer them directly to services. That's now in 6 cities in this country. It's going to grow. It's a national movement. You ought to be asking why that isn't happening in Chicago. And I can give you some reasons why it's not happening in Chicago. We can do a lot about cash bail. Right now, cash bail in Cook County Jail is a means test. It's morally outrageous that if you're poor, you stay in jail awaiting your trial. And the average length of stay while you're waiting for your case to be called is 25 days. You're there if you can't afford bail. You're not there if you're wealthy enough to pay bail. You can affect that policy. You can affect reentry. I told you that 50% of all people who come out go back in with 3 years. That's because they can't get jobs. That's because of laws and licensure restrictions that keep them from getting jobs. That's changed a lot in the last year. Rauner has just signed a bill, Governor Rauner has signed a bill that makes a big difference, but we can do more. Now, I'm going to close with maybe what I should have started with, which is what are the religious issues at stake. I'm going to read you a long statement from, keep in mind, he actually was an evangelical Christian, but first and foremost, I think, professionally he was a lawyer, from William Stuntz. The massive numbers of young black men and the increasingly large numbers of young black women who live in prison cells aren't the victims in the way that slaves were. Their conduct is important, but they are human beings, They are creatures entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as long as they permit their fellow human beings to seek those same ends. Their humanity entitles them to something else, a measure of understanding, and the mercy that flows from a justice system whose rulers remember that they too, that's us, are tempted to do wrong and often yield to temptation. That understanding and that mercy, in turn, flow from an idea that was once so well understood it never needed to be expressed, yet now is all but forgotten. The idea that legal condemnation is necessary. Yes, we need a legal system, but it's a terrible thing, and it should be used sparingly, but to be used sparingly and not promiscuously. Bill Coffin, who was chaplain at Yale in my years there, once said, poverty is violence in slow motion. Poverty is violence in slow motion. Well, so is incarceration. What we all forget is what happens when people are arrested. And often their lives are ruined just because of the arrest. But certainly when they're moved to Cook County Jail, they are, and I'm going to use a crude word, especially if you result of police sweeps, they're screwed. Police sweeps get them into jail. They sit in jail for 25 years before their cases, 25 days on average before their case is even heard. They've lost their job. Their family has been separated. And then, given the fact that 95% of the cases are plea bargaining, they're probably going to go to jail. So, and that is an act of violence in people's lives. Now, I'm going to read one more paragraph from Stuntz, because it has the key word that I think is our religious obligation. One reason black criminals from poor city neighborhoods have been treated with so much more severity than criminals from white immigrant communities in America's past is that the former are more categorized as the other, as people whose lives are separate from the lives of those who judge them. The phrase "the other," the fact that we're in a different world than most of the people that are being brought forward in our criminal justice system. We did again, legalizing marijuana. Drug policy is a whole separate thing here. In Rhode Island, we got police and doctors and clergy, namely myself, to have a forum called Cops, Docs, and Clergy Against the War on Drugs. And all those groups are coming forward now. And present at that group was Janet Cooper Nelson, who's the chaplain of Brown University. Listen to what she said at that conference. The church has been judgmental, not inclusive. We have banished the topic of drug use and addiction, though we surely shouldn't have. Keep in mind, 1 in every 8 has a lived experience with addiction. Life is not that simple. How much of this can be brought up in a church setting? This raises questions of intimacy. This is not an easy question, but the church is too busy being respectful. And then she said, our message should be one of radical inclusivity, not creating the other in our society. So, what's the Christian response? Let's just go to the basic text. Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. Matthew 25, hopefully you know it almost by heart. Come you that are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom I prepared for you, said Jesus to the kingdom of nations, to the people on His right. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. People on the right say, when did we do these things just as you did it? Jesus answers, to the least of these, who are members of my family. You did it unto me. Now, you know those texts, but I heard a wonderful sermon last week, which is on our website, and I hope you will get our newsletter, because it's printed there. The preacher got up and he read these texts, which you've all heard, and he said, you know, these aren't metaphors. That's how we dismiss them. We say, okay, nice stuff. It's kind of a metaphor. Yeah, we are the city of God, and there's us, and that's over there. They're not metaphors. That's what we're called to do. We have to respond to them. Otherwise, how can we as a church call ourselves the body of Christ?
Thank you, Al.
Well, Reverend Al Sharp, thank you very much for your introduction, for your help in organizing this series. We will be proceeding in the next couple of weeks with some interesting talks. Ramal Cole is going to come and talk. We may have seen featured in the Tribune last week about his experience in working with juveniles in the jail and his response to that. We're going to hear from the Public Defender's Office about how the system works in practice, as Alan described it, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you. And by the way, just in case someone didn't hear, we do have copies of Maurer's book in the back, The Race to Incarcerate, a graphic book, with library cards for you to sign your name and phone number and email address. And please do borrow one and read it and bring it back in due course whenever you're done. Thank you very much.